Stories don't come much more, accidentally, timely than the one in which Port Charles, like huge swaths of the United States, was hit by a blizzard. But one thing viewers weren't thrilled with was the snow job General Hospital tried to pull where Windermere Castle is concerned. In the episode airing Tuesday, January 27th, recapped here, there was plenty of action developing. Tracy plotted with Emma and Gio, Sonny got new intel regarding the attempts on his life, and Charlotte ditched her would-be guardians. But it was one particular scene in the show's closing moment which got folks talking. When Joss picked up a pair of binoculars to look across the water at Spoon Island, she saw Windermere, which looked somewhat different than the Gothic mansion we've known and loved for years. To be clear, it's not only the inside of the castle we've seen. Back in 2010, Windermere was featured in the opening credits, as depicted below. The estate has a storied history in Port Charles, long home to the Cassadine clan. Ironically, it was also home to the supposedly late Faison, who may or may not currently be haunting Anna, but the version fans saw in today's episode was distinctly different. In fact, as Andrew Altenberg said, perfectly mimicking the voiceover which accompanies a new actor taking over a role, the role of Windermere will now be played by the set of a Wes Anderson movie. For those not in on the joke, this is the new version of Windermere. And this is a poster for the 2014 movie, The Grand Budapest Hotel. To say fans noticed the difference would be an understatement. David had an interesting theory which he shared, tongue firmly planted in cheek, on X. In my mind, he suggested, this is the Spoon Island Welcome Center that you can walk through as soon as the launch drops you off, and the real Windermere Castle is off to the left. More than a few summed up the situation by suggesting that former resident Helena Cassadine would not be amused. Frankly, we tend to agree. But we want to hear what you have to say. Hit the comment section with your thoughts on the new, and we'd say, not so improved Windermere. They called it the Great Port Charles Whiteout, a whim of weather that arrived like a dramatic stagehand pulling a gauzy curtain across the city. Snow came in thick, fat flakes, each one seeming to linger in midair just long enough to be photographed by the imagination, then piled itself into drifts that swallowed stoops, lamp posts, and gossip in equal measure. For many residents, the blizzard meant canceled appointments and shovels. For others, it meant stolen moments of quiet in a life otherwise full of loud entrances and even louder secrets. For Windermere, it meant something else entirely: exposure. On the east-facing cliff that had, for generations, kept watch over Spoon Island, Windermere reared like a storybook relic, its turrets spitting powdered froth, its gargoyles huddled in white collars. That's what everyone remembered, at least, a Gothic mass of stone and shadow, a place where secrets liked to make nests. That's what the opening credits promised, a castle carved of weather and whispered names, the kind of house that stored grudges in the rafters and lullabies in locked trunks. Tonight, though, the cameras saw something other than carved stone. Through the lens Joss had lifted, a pair of binoculars fogged from the warmth of her breath, the castle looked, at first glance, perfectly at odds with everything it had ever been. Atop the cliff was a confection, candy colors muted by snowfall, a symmetrical facade crowned by ornate flourishes that seemed more pastry than portcullis. Windows blinked in pastel frames. The manor's silhouette resembled something you would see in a photograph of a fairy tale hotel or a carefully staged Wes Anderson set. Every angle considered, every color balanced. It was meticulous, anachronistic, and utterly, infuriatingly wrong. Joss lowered the binoculars and blinked. Is that Windermere? She asked aloud, the question more to steady herself than to demand an answer. Beside her, glorious in her impatience, was Tracy. Tracy had the kind of gaze that did not tolerate shabby craftsmanship, architectural or otherwise. She pressed her gloved fingers to the lenses and peered. If that's Windermere, she said, someone has been redecorating without asking the family. How could they? Joss whispered. The air between them was of fragile glass. It felt like the city had been turned into a diorama where even small changes looked like sacrilege. By the time the episode cut to commercial, the internet was already burning. Phones hummed with screenshots. Fans snapped comparisons as if they were detectives assembling evidence. One image of the castle as it had always been, another of the new, impossibly groomed building that might have been less a castle than a carefully curated film prop. Andrew Altenberg, bless his melodramatic soul, had joked that Windermere would now be played by the set of a Wes Anderson movie, and the joke landed with the precision of a thrown pebble on a frozen pond. People laughed until they were angry. They loved the wordplay, and yet their hearts tightened. It was not just aesthetics. Windermere carried the weight of family history, Cassadine history, the lore that made Helena's name mutterable like a spell. Helena Cassadine did not like being fobbed off with decorations. She had preferred, when she was alive and when she was not quite dead, the timeline of soap opera mortality being a garden of familiar flowers, an empire of dread and dramatic entrances. To suggest she might be amused by pastel facades was to suggest a symphony might be well served by a kazoo. Back at the Metro Court, Emma was balancing a plan in one hand and a coffee in the other. Plans had become her currency, and tonight currency was being spent. She and Gio were working through the logistics of Tracy's scheme, which involved as much charm as it did plausible deniability. "If we can distract Sonny," Emma said, as if addressing a particularly stubborn equation, "we might buy time for the kids." "It's messy, but it's honest." Joe's laugh came short and tight. He had learned, in a line of fire and favors, that honest was a soap opera's way of meaning risky. "Messy is the name of our little enterprise," he said. "And maybe that's the only way to get anything done when the weather's staging its own revolution." Sonny, meanwhile, was trying to parse a different kind of revolution. He had new intel, an envelope with a soft corner, and the kind of handwriting that trembled when it wanted to stay hidden. Attempts on his life had taken on the air of a conspiracy. The blizzard had made it easier for someone to move in the shadows. He unfolded the paper in the safety of the distillery, the lines forming like little fences in a field of white. He had an enemy who knew his patterns, who could read his alliances like a map. There was a sense that the cold had sharpened people's edges. On Spoon Island, the mournful gulls ignored the human squabbles and fluffed their wings against the wind. The island's welcome center, of the sort David teased about on X. "This is the Spoon Island Welcome Center," he'd claimed. "Walk in and the real Windermere is off to the left," had never been more ridiculous. The ferry came and went, carrying visitors who wanted to gawk at the place where myth met real estate. Tourists asked for guided explanations of Cassadine lore, like it was a museum piece. Some of them hoped to see ghosts. Others hoped to simply get a postcard. The blizzard ensured that fewer postcards made it into mailboxes. And Helena, oh Helena, she had a way of arriving in an atmosphere and making the air rearrange itself. Whether in life or the half-life afforded her by the soap writer's vaunted insistence on dramatic returns, she remained the kind of presence that rearranged furniture without touching it. Tonight, though, she could do nothing about the facade. She had amped up the winds, sent a blot of fog to swallow the cliffs on more than one occasion. She had, according to rumor, once ordered a small storm to put hair back into place. But pastel turrets were a different sort of affront. They felt as if someone had repainted her memories with candy-tinted varnish. Fans rallied as if in a small, focused rebellion. Online threads swelled with opinions, outrage, yes, but also a kind of tender grief. Someone posted an image of Windermere as it had been in 2010. Another user layered the Grand Budapest Hotel poster over the screenshot, and the two images overlapped like mismatched wedding rings. Comments cascaded. Some framed it as a betrayal. Others treated it as farce, a prank the writers would surely acknowledge in the next episode with a knowing wink. The truth in Port Charles, as in life, was far more complicated. In a dim hallway of Windermere itself, perhaps the only place on earth where the house had often been the villain and its inhabitants the victims of inheritance, the past was having a conference. Paint peeled from the walls in complaint, and the portraits eyed each other like chairs at a family reunion. The house, it seemed, had opinions. It had been home to Cassadines, to a Faison who might or might not have died in a way that satisfied anyone, to best-selling crimes and nearly successful resurrections. It had a memory better than many of its living occupants. Helena's portrait hung above a landing, wherein her painted eyes seemed to hold a private joke. When the snow suffocated the city, the portrait's gaze sharpened. A draft made the frame creak like a throat clearing. "They have painted me candy," her painted lips mused. The painting, of course, couldn't move. It could only look. But Helena never had been good at being only a painting. She had a history of making the inanimate come alive to supply her with companionship. Late that night, as wind scraped the windows like an uninvited narrator, a knock sounded on the door of a small, otherwise normal tugboat moored near Spoon Island. The ferry's captain, a practical man with hands like brick, found a letter tucked into the railing. No handwriting, no return. The letter smelled faintly of roses and old perfume. Inside was one line: "The house has been dressed for a stranger's ball. I will not attend." The captain, practical as ever, pocketed the note like a coin. Joss, who had been looking across the water earlier, found herself unable to sleep. She thought of turrets she had once meant to defend, of the way a building could be an accusation. The binoculars lay on her nightstand like a small telescope of regret. She wrapped the sweater tighter and looked again, not with optics now, but with memory. Windmere was both a place and an attitude, she thought. Someone had misinterpreted the attitude. Across town, Charlotte, who had refused guardians that night, preferring adventure, perhaps, or sharp independence, wandered the avenues like a comet. The blizzard made the streets into a blank page. At the edges of the page, people left traces of themselves that a reader might have missed. She watched as neighbors shoveled paths and older citizens shared pots of soup. She watched a child sled down a hill and a dog chase its joy. In a small, human moment, the world felt reparable. When word reached the Cassadine descendants, who are always, somewhere in the city, either dukes of despair or princes of plot, the reactions were a sequence of letters and exclamations. Valentine, always practical, saw liability. Tourists, trademark preservation. Spin, always reliable, could be had. He drafted a press release about honoring the property's heritage while embracing evolution. He used the word evolution with a kind of theatrical distaste reserved for enemy manifests. Meanwhile, in the quiet of a hospital corridor, where the city's lives and bodies come to rest and be repaired, news of Windmere's makeover trickled like gossip through linen. Nurses laughed at the idea of Helena in pink. Doctors said nothing. They had seen stranger things in operating theaters. Anna listened, and when Anna listened, the past leaned in like a conspirator with good teeth. She had a history, private, tender, and brutally honest, with both Helena and Faison. The two names carried different weights in her chest, scales tipped in ways that did not always make sense to onlookers. For Anna, the painted facade was not merely aesthetic. It was an insult to the memory of people who had been wronged there, sometimes by their own hands. It was too soon for an actual haunting, but in Port Charles, things that may or may not be alive make themselves visible by the facts people choose to remember. The town's theatrical nature argued that even a storm could be an actor. Tonight it had played its part and exited. The new Windmere remained, all angles and careful composition, like a stage set at rest. Fans continued to argue, a chorus that would not be silenced by snow. One fan, an artist in Ohio, painted a picture that quickly went viral, a melancholic, pastel-colored Windmere at dusk, its windows lit with the familiar warm warning of a place that still housed power. In the painting, Helena's silhouette stood on a balcony, hands on the railing, seeming to survey her domain with the kind of disappointed dignity only a queen could own. The artist captioned it, simply, "Helena does not approve." The post collected likes and laments. It felt, weirdly, like a plea. And then, as if to remind everyone that storylines preferred drama, the show's writers, blessed or cursed by their love of the theatrical, crafted a sequence that turned outrage into an opportunity. In the next episode, when the cameras surged back to Windmere, the set had been altered again. The pastel facade remained only as a memory. During the filming, a mysterious contractor had claimed the building needed structural improvements. The crew framed it as a continuity issue, but diehard fans knew better. Helena's portrait had been moved to a different wall between shots. A prop man swore he had heard a mumbled unfashionable pass his lips in a language no one present claimed to speak. At the center of it all, Helena orchestrated nothing and everything. In fan forums, they debated whether a woman who could not bear being upstaged by Mauve would resurrect herself just to rearrange some shutters. They speculated that she would appear, not in fury,